Today on Ascend, the Great Books podcast, we cover the first part of Euripides The Bacchae, a chilling yet captivating Greek tragedy that questions piety, erotic desire, the divine, and societal order. The main character of the Bacchae is a god. It's Dionysus. But he's undergone a terrible transformation. The jovial wine god of Homer is made into something cruel and beyond classification, a divine that is worshipped through frenzied madness and the bestial release of sex and violence. I am utterly fascinated by this play. Its graphic images and raw intensity, set alongside an ambiguous moral, gives a lot of room for discussion. But I'm particularly interested in it because it serves as an antecedent to Plato's Symposium, which in turn shaped Western spirituality for almost 1,000 years, or for really over 1,000 years. Moreover, this play has several stark, clear parallels to Jesus Christ and the Gospels. It has a very nascent spiritual message in it, I think, for the West that we'll see develop with inside the Western canon. So again, this play has layers, bloody, terrible layers, but it is certainly worth your time. So join me and the always insightful Dr. Frank Grabowski as we discuss the darkly mesmerizing drama of the Bacchae. Welcome to Ascend the Great Books podcast. My name is Deacon Harrison Garlick, a husband, father, and serve as the Chancellor and General Counsel for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Tulsa. It's a beautiful evening here in rural Oklahoma. You can check us out on Twitter or X, YouTube, Facebook, and Patreon. We appreciate all of our supporters. You can check out thegreatbookspodcast.com, where we have various guides up for classical works that you can go and check out. And today we are discussing The Bacchae by Euripides, one of my favorite plays. We also have a guest. So friend of the podcast, Dr. Frank Grabowski, professor of philosophy at Rogers State, member of our Sunday Great Books group that meets at my home, teacher at our new classical high school here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and a third order Franciscan. Dr.
Wow.
Grabowski, how are you doing?
Love titles. Doing really well. This has been a great summer. I always go into summer as a college professor wondering how I'm going to spend the next 3 months. And more often than not, the time goes by so quickly and I look back at the summer squandered. But this has actually been quite productive, and it's actually been quite positive in terms of just my moral and spiritual growth too. So in fact, this weekend, I'm going to be driving out to Oklahoma City to meet up with Father Elkin and my other members of my formation cohorts to have a spiritual retreat. So I'm really looking forward.
Very good.
Yeah, it's been wonderful.
Very good. And the you're also in the diaconate formation program.
Yes,
probably should mention that.
Yeah.
Also studying to be a deacon.
Also studying to be a deacon. Again, a man needs a purpose in life, and it's not one of marriage and childbearing and rearing that. I really find that I'm being called to a diaconate vocation. So yeah, it's been great. The guys in the cohort are great, and you and the other members of the institute who've been taking us through these difficult texts and really helping us to grow intellectually and really helping to build the fraternity. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, it has been. It's been wonderful to read the great books in the setting of like formation of clerics, but also particularly because when you teach in the diaconate program, it's all adults, and that kind of brings in like a really unique aspect. And so there are all these men, and they're mainly 40s and 50s, early 60s, and for a lot of them, like this is the first time they're ever going to read the Iliad, right? This is the first time. So we read.
Yes.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that's precisely. I mean, what's been so fascinating about the last year of formation is that you and Dr. Malash and Dr. Spencer have walked us through the great books, through scripture, through some philosophy, and it's quite remarkable. And obviously, a lot can be attributed to your talents as teachers, but I mean, just to see these men who, as you said, are by and large, novices when it comes to these books and philosophy, just how they managed to grow in their reading comprehension, in their analysis. And so it's been to me, it's been a great experience, not just personally, because I think I've grown as a reader, but it's been a great joy, and a great pleasure to see these other men really grow, not only just in their ability to read, but in their love of reading and their love of these great books. They're really
Yeah,
passionate about it. It's
I
genuine.
think we had a lot that were a little suspect at the beginning. It's like, hey, come join the diaconate program. You're gonna learn to be a deacon. By the way, we're reading the Iliad, and
Right.
I am grateful for my superiors in the program that allow a Great Books formation program to be part of our formation,
Yeah.
just simply because I think that's unique. And a lot of them didn't read the Great Books, so they're kind of looking at the fruit that it bears on the men immediately. But it has been like, it's just been a joy to kind of walk with the group through a lot of these texts. And some of the texts that we've read this year, so in the formation program, we read the Iliad, and then we read the Oresteia, and then we read Antigone, right? And then Bacchae. Is that all of them? I think so.
Yeah.
And for some of those texts, I was still pretty green to them, and so actually to have those discussions with a group was really helpful. I just, as we kind of, whether it's on Twitter or talking to people, and they're like, how do you get your insights in the text, or how do you get familiar with it, or what commentaries do you recommend? And there are good secondary literature, but honestly, reading a text more than once, like just reading a text, I think is the absolute best commentary. Because the first time you read something, like whether it's the Bacchae or the Iliad, you're simply trying to grasp the literal. Like you might also be grasping some of like the allegorical or the analogs behind the scenes, but a lot of your attention, your effort is just trying to understand the literal, like what's actually happening. And that makes sense because the literal is the foundation, right? That's where all these analogs have to rest. They rest in the literal. You have to understand literally what's happening in the text. Right. So literally just reading them again, I think provides one of the best commentaries. And I actually think that, I was reflecting on this the other day, reading them in a group is somewhat of a cheat or a hack to that. Because when you read it in a group, it's like you've read it multiple times simultaneously, right? Because someone else has done the work to read it another time. And hopefully, like, you're reading it with insightful people. They bring a different insight, right? So like if we're sitting there, chit-chatting about a book, or I guarantee will happen tonight with the Bacchae, it's like, here's the theme that I really pulled out. Here's what really stood out to me. And here's all the different ways I see it playing in. But then someone else is like, oh, well, no, wait, look, I also see this. And it's really beneficial to read things in a group because it really does serve as a way that you've read a text like multiple times.
And I think that's, your emphasis on reading together in a group has been really, I think, so valuable in impressing upon the cohort and also those who attend your monthly meetups at your house, that just how valuable it is for the individual to read the text and to bring his or her thoughts to the table. Like, again, all the credit to you and the other professors of the cohort. Yes, there are times where the teacher has to lecture and has to present certain ideas. But you've really allowed us to make discoveries on our own. And that was most evident the month you unfortunately were unable to attend when we had our presentations. And I mentioned to you in private, and I mentioned to others too, just how impressive it was to listen to these non-PhDs, these non-MAs, the people who have not, who are not credentialed in the classics, handle these difficult texts with great maturity and with a certain degree of mastery. And again, I think that says a lot about how the pedagogical approach that you've taken, but also the joy and the excitement that you bring to class. That these are not just texts that we have to learn for the quiz, but that there's real valuable that these really do address some important issues involving the human condition, man's relationship to the gods, and so on. So
yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, there's perennial questions here. That's why we read the great books, right? There's these perennial questions and commentaries on the human condition. And we should say, I think that how we've structured our diaconate program with this great book sequence here in Tulsa is, we it's like joining the National Guard. It's 1 week in a month, and so I get to teach on Friday nights for 2 hours. So for 2 hours, I have the cohort on Friday night, and we have it basically a Socratic circle on whatever text, and then the rest of the weekend is basically dedicated to systematic theology and practicums and general formation. But then once a year in the cycle, they allow me to teach the entire weekend. But instead of teaching it, what I do is I break all the texts that we've read into themes and say, okay, what are the major themes that we've done? Because one of the problems with only talking to each other for 2 hours a month is we barely have enough time to discuss the text. We don't have a lot of time to do comparative literature. And so the whole weekend then, which I did miss it because of the birth of my 5th child. So I had somewhat of an excuse. But I did, don't tell my wife, but I did really, really pained me to miss the weekend because I don't teach the weekend. So what I do, for the listener is I can't remember, we have 7 or 8 sessions and we have 7 themes. We talk about suffering, we talk about arete, we talk about providence, right?
Piety,
yeah. All these deep themes that we've tracked mainly since the Iliad. And the cohort breaks into groups and then presents on these questions that I've given them. I even meet with them throughout the month prior to the presentation to make sure they're on the right track. And yeah, a lot of their stuff I wouldn't answer for them, right? Like tonight, one of the questions that kept coming up in the studies was, is Pentheus a good person? Is he virtuous?
Right.
And that threw everyone for a loop. And the reason I mention this and just go into detail is because we should mention that we're going to do this on the podcast too. So we're going to do the same thing. So we've got the Bacchae, and then I've got 2, or I think we're going to have 2 on Aristophanes. So we're going to read the clouds, and then we'll read the frogs. And then we're going to have a roundtable on all these plays, and really kind of even touch back into Homer, because it's hard to talk about the plays without talking about Homer, and really just have a whole podcast dedicated to a roundtable, invite a lot of the people who helped us through the plays to talk about these themes, to actually pluck out suffering, to pluck out, virtue, to pluck out providence and fate, and actually talk about like, how do we see these in different authors? And I'm very much looking forward to that conversation.
No, I am too. Again, I can't help but stress how fun it is to see people who would not otherwise read these texts, read them without any sense of intimidation, but beyond that, to read them with a great sense of love and interest. I saw that in the presentations. I see that every month that we meet at your house and at St. Francis for formation. That the conversation doesn't just happen when you walk into the room, Deacon. The conversations are happening on GroupMe. They're happening, when we're having our meal, or even before class or in between classes. And there are varying levels of interest. Obviously, some people are, some of the members of the cohort are more interested than others. But I think every single one of them appreciates, what you're exposing us to. And I think we've gotten to a point where, just to give you one example, there's a member of the cohort who, interestingly enough, and I was shocked, pleasantly, not that I didn't expect anyone to post this on GroupMe, but somebody had posted an image of the cover of the Leo Strauss commentary on Euthyphro.
Oh, really?
And I thought, my goodness, like of all the commentaries, it was recently published. Maybe it was the first hit on Amazon. I'm not going to say one way or the other, but I thought, my goodness, and I own it, and I've been trying to get through it. It's a slog because it's just notes. I have it right here. It's just like his notes collected and an interpretive essay, and But my point is that shows that we have these ambitious individuals who are trying to get a head start on working out what the Euthyphro is about, because they don't want to show up and, well, I'm sure some of it is competitive, but they don't want to embarrass themselves, but they also want to make real contributions to the discussion. They want to be part of this process. And I think that's wonderful.
And if anyone's unfamiliar, after the Poetics, we're going to go into Plato. So actually not here too long. We've got 2 episodes on Aristophanes, and then the round table, and then we're launching into Plato, and we're going to be studying Plato for a little bit. And so actually that Leo Strauss commentary / notebook
Yeah.
on the Euthyphro. That is a wonderful little volume.
Have you read
It
it?
is a wonderful volume. I have it. I have not dug into it deep.
I've been trying
It
to
is
read.
my goal is actually to read that and use it as prep for the Euthyphro for the podcast.
Yeah. And I think, just one last comment on, as we transition from these plays, the poetry to Plato. I mean, it's in a way, a seamless transition because of the way that Plato writes. He writes dialogues, and I think that's something to always be mindful of, is that these are not just philosophical works, but they're dramatic, and it's important to see how the philosophy and the drama inform each other.
Yeah, no, very much so. Yeah, it's actually said that Plato wrote a lot of plays, and then upon meeting Socrates and deciding to follow him, he burned them all.
He burned them all, right? Yeah.
But luckily, or providentially for us, the dramatist in him survived, and we get these wonderful dialogues. And it just as a reminder to everyone, right? This is why are we reading the Greek plays, right? They actually serve as this intellectual bridge between Homer and Plato. And I'm so glad we did this because
me too.
I did not. The plays were not a part of my initial great books formation. Actually, neither was Homer. We dove straight into Plato, which then kind of makes Socrates seem like he popped out of a vacuum. Right. Like, where does a guy like this even come from? But after reading Homer and then seeing how the playwrights, the tragedians, interact with him, but the questions and the principles that they're pulling out of these kind of legendary stories, to my mind, as you read it, a philosopher coming out of this culture now all of a sudden is not too shocking, right? That someone would say, you know what, instead of doing a play, why don't we actually do a writing that just does a drama on a philosophical principle? And then you really see how Plato's dialogues didn't pop out of a vacuum. They actually kind of organically grew out of this incredibly rich Greek culture.
Yeah, and just one last comment before maybe we jump into the Bacchae, and that is, this whole the experience of reading these texts, both in formation and with the group, the Great Books group that meets monthly. It's been wonderful for me, just on a personal level, because I'm so accustomed to reading works of philosophy, and so I'm very good at abstractions. In other words, like I can sort of work out big ideas in my head, and so I find reading Aristotle very easy, and I find reading Kant very easy, which most people find to be very strange. And literature has always been difficult for me, and I've kind of wondered, why is that? And I think what I've discovered recently is that reading literature forces a person to try to picture in one's own mind what's happening. In other words, to come up with an image, very much a spatial image. And of course, when for instance, there's the great fight between Achilles and Hector. I mean, what you picture may not necessarily be what I picture, but yet we still have formed in our minds particular instances of these individuals and how they're related to each other. And to me, that's an important step in improving one's reading comprehension, because it forces you first to sort of work with the particular, and then you can kind of then move to the more abstract questions involving justice and piety and beauty and some of these other things. And so it's really helped, I think, me, and I'm by no means I haven't completed my journey, but this has really helped me on a personal level to be a better reader.
No, that's beautiful, and I appreciate you sharing that, because I mean, like we talked about with the gentleman in your class. One of our theses at the beginning is, if you read Homer, if you read the playwrights, you will become a better reader of Scripture. And when you return to Scripture, you're going to have a much broader skill set, if you will, to actually extract the principles from this, but not even like a cold abstraction, to try and read Scripture as I think it's supposed to be read, right? As this drama where all these details matter, right? The greatest teachers teach in story. Actually, the greatest teachers don't write, right? Socrates and Christ, right? The greatest teachers don't write.
They just talk. They
just talk.
Yeah.
But then their followers, right, then very much communicate those truths in stories, whether it's the dialogues, the dramas, the gospels, etc. So I think there's a lot of richness there to learning how to receive these philosophical principles from the drama, not as like a cold abstraction from them, like, because that's how Plato used to be taught, right? You just we don't need
Right.
to read we don't need to read the drama. Also, just go read Aristotle, right? Why even read Plato? Like, just read Aristotle because he's already abstracted it all. And I think, actually, speaking of Strauss, I think Strauss was probably almost single-handedly the one that brought back into the academy, like, no, you have to read these as a drama, and these little details matter, and there's a lot more in these texts than just like one on its face philosophical principle.
And that the way you put it, I think, is crucial. He brought back into the academy, which suggests that it was lost.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that there was a very rich history preceding, dating all the way, I'm sure, back to the ancient world, where the dialogues were very much treated as such. And then people became prudential and they became experts, and then they didn't care about the dramatist persona. They didn't care about the setting. They just give me the ideas behind all of these characters. And yeah, you really lose. I mean, you and I think, some would argue you completely miss Plato's.
Agreed. Well, we're not quite the Plato. I'm really excited to get there. It's going to be wonderful to read Plato in this group, but we are still enjoying the Greek plays. So tonight, we are reading The Bacchae by Euripides. So maybe just some like brass tacks before we jump into the text itself. So Euripides was born in 480 BC and died around 406 BC. He is one of the major tragedians, along with Aeschylus and Sophocles, both of who we've covered here on the podcast. It said he wrote over 90 plays. We have 18 to 19 of them. One of them is the authenticity is questioned. His personal life is somewhat of a disaster. He had two failed marriages, and actually legends grew that he just left society to live in a cave and write. He just kind of ostracized himself. He's also often presented as cantankerous, a recluse, a curmudgeon. Most of his adult life was during the conflict of Athens and Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. He actually dies right before that conflict comes to an end. In 408 BC, at the age of 70, he entered into voluntary exile and left Athens for Macedon and died there in 406. So he dies in exile. It was there that he wrote his last plays, which included the Bacchae, and his son, aptly named Euripides the Younger, brought them back to Athens to be produced. So this is one of the last plays that we're reading today that he put together. The Bacchae itself was produced in 405 BC in Athens. So the first time it was actually put on stage was 405, and it actually won first prize. It should be mentioned that the play has come down to us is not complete. So if you haven't read it yet, that was a spoiler for me because I didn't know that when I read it. I did not know that. And I got to the end. I was like, what is this? So there's the gist of the story, actually way more than a gist, but substantial parts of the story are there, but we have some lines towards the end that are missing. And so it's not, the one copy we have is not exactly intact. Anything else on like the Euripides or the play itself?
Well, I guess the one thing that I would mention is just that, also at the time, were living both Sophocles and Socrates. In fact, to give you some dates, so Sophocles' dates are 497 to 406, so they died in the same year. So they were, again, roughly the same age. And Socrates 470 to 399. So again, it may not always be a good idea to historically locate these plays within a historical context, what was going on at the time. But I do think that given what was happening with the Peloponnesian War, given what was happening with Socrates, and this may come up in our discussion today in the apology, one of the charges that he was to defend himself against was promoting gods other than those that were sponsored by or worshipped in Athens. And so, this is an issue that comes up in Bacchae, which is you have a new god, and what are you supposed to do, right? He just shows up.
Mm-hmm.
So, and to give you Plato's dates, 428 to 348. So it's very likely that Plato, as a young man, a teenager or in his early 20s, would have witnessed some of these plays being.
Yeah, the intellectual richness that popped out of Greece during this time period is almost unfathomable.
It's off the charts, yeah.
And that goes back to, a lot of times on the podcast, we've talked about Greek reason coupled together with Hebrew faith and a Roman order prepared the world to receive Jesus Christ. And one of the things to that, I think, on its face, is just how much Athens, particularly, like just the intellectual reflection and kind of antecedent philosophy and the philosophy itself that came out of this polis in a very short period of time.
And also, and I don't know exactly the population of Athens, but the listeners have to think that we're not talking about Dallas, Fort Worth. We're not talking about New York City. We're talking about a relatively, small polis, a relatively small. So one would, I think, be, it would be reasonable to say that they may not have known each other personally, but it was a very tight knit, intellectual and artistic community. And so I think that's also, worth bearing in mind.
And one thing we're going to see too is that then sometimes they interact, and the tragedians, they typically write about legends that they have received, and they take them, they modify them, they kind of build the myths. But the comics, right, like Aristophanes, tend to invite or invent new stories, but use modern people. And so when we read The Clouds by Aristophanes, which I think we're reading next, that one is all about lampooning Socrates. Like Socrates is actually a character in the play itself. And then after that, we'll read Aristophanes' Frogs. And the premise of that one is that Dionysus thinks all the new tragedians are terrible. So he goes down to hell, he goes down to Hades to get Euripides back, to bring Euripides back. And it's a funny premise, but he's getting him back because in there it admits that the poets, the playwrights, are teachers, and Athens has lost its lesson. Athens needs to be taught some lessons.
Yeah, that's so brilliant. Yeah.
And then when he goes down there, he realizes that Aeschylus is actually the one that's praised as the best, and him and Euripides are fighting. And so Dionysus hosts a poetry contest between the two to actually see who's better to go back to Athens and save it. And it's really fascinating because they critique each other's poetry.
Yeah.
So it's a wonderful kind of comedic play. I'm new to it. I'm kind of simmering in it, if you will.
Yeah, I haven't read I've read Clouds.
It's a very different type of read. So maybe taking a step back then, Euripides, that's the Bacchae. Why do we read this, right? So the listeners who have read it, that are reading along with us, kind of as we kind of wrap up the Greek plays right here towards the end, this play is very different. And we're going to get into the reasons, but I mean, it is different. And then also, a lot of people might have been put off, just morally speaking, right? I mean, it's a very immoral play insofar as the bestial release, the implied sexuality, at least, the violence is done throughout all the relationships, the perversion of those relationships. So we read this in our diaconate formation program for the formation of, Catholic clerics. So why do we read this? And so I think there's a few thoughts that occur to me. One is that this really sets up Plato's Symposium well. And so we're going to read Plato's Symposium when we get into reading Plato. And Plato's Symposium takes place right after one of these famous contests where Agathon, the poet, has won. And they're going to give all these speeches about eros, but the judge is Dionysus. And Dionysus actually haunts the whole dialogue. They're drinking or not drinking wine. Alcibiades comes in, basically dressed like Dionysus with his Bacchae. Like, the premise that we see in this play about what Dionysus represents, Plato very much riffs off that in his Symposium. So it's kind of important to understand how he's being presented, because we should note, and we'll get into this in the text, that the Dionysus, this god of wine that we find in the Bacchae, is very, very different than the god we saw in Homer. In Homer, we get a brief reference to him, and he's like scared of a mortal and hiding under the skirt of, Thetis the sea nymph, if memory serves. This one is cruel, licentious, just almost.
Well, he's diabolical.
Yeah, he's diabolical. Demonic. He just seems to enact a certain cruelty that has no emotional impact on him. So he can turn people inside out,
Well,
have them
it's
ripped
a
apart by their mothers.
malevolence, right? It's a malevolence. Like the way that he, without any sort of a conscious empathy or sympathy, right? We'll get into this. Truly, yes. I mean, he wants people to revere him, to worship him, but the means by which he accomplishes this seem totally counterproductive.
Well, that's a great premise, because I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, what is his purpose in coming to Thebes, and is he actually doing it correctly, or do
Right.
his actions and his words like actually align? But actually, even taking a step back as a preliminary, one of the things that I want to ask is, when we read this, is do we like, what is the purpose of the play from Euripides' standpoint? And just to let everyone know, this is kind of a blood on the floor conversation about what did Euripides actually mean by this play. And so there's a few things I think I'll throw out, not in a conclusory way right now, but to kind of like maybe get us thinking as we move through it, which is one is that it's a critique of religion, that religion is anti-logos. It's destructive. It turns the family inside out. It turns the polis inside out. It is destructive, and it's an anti-logos, anti-logic creature, to the degree that in the Enlightenment, Pentheus was often presented as a hero, right? Like one who pushed back against, this blind faith of religion. Mm-hmm. So that's certainly one way. The other way could be that it's not religion wholesale that he's pushing back against, right? That maybe he is not fighting the entire pantheon, but there's something about the Dionysian cult that he's trying to point out. And we'll even tether it to what I just mentioned. The Dionysus in this play is very different than the Dionysus in Homer. What's happened? And why is his cult, that we're even told in this play, has spread now throughout all of Hellas? What has happened to it? And I think one thing to note here is how often Euripides talks about that the cults come from the East. Over and over again, he talks about they've been imported from the East. And I think that's a fact that I think we have to, take into account. The other one is that this is actually a praise of Dionysus, that it's not a critique, it's not a warning, it's a praise of him. And I think it's a hard read. It's hard to see that in the text itself. Also, we should note, for the listeners, that Euripides, as part of his kind of cantankerous curmudgeon background, was also very much known for being a critic of the pantheon. He was known for being critical of the gods. So him writing a play being critical of, an Olympian religion is not outside the ambit of what would be expected of him. So I think for me personally, as I read through the play, you have this oscillation of like, how much is this a critique of religion wholesale? And how much is this a critique of something specific that's happened to the Dionysian cult? Or does he think the Dionysian cult is an analog for religion as a whole? Like, these are some of the things we have to play out.
And I think that's a great way of setting this up, Deacon. And truly, I'm at a point where I think the answer to that question, that initial question, for me is inconclusive. I honestly don't know. And that may, in fact, be the brilliance of the play, is that Euripides is very ambiguous and unclear about what we're to make of the ultimate message, like what point Euripides is trying to get across to us. And it may very well be that Euripides himself is unsure.
Yeah, so what did he try and offer us here, poetically with his dying breath, right? This is one of his last works. What did he have to offer us? And I think that what Euripides' point is, like I said earlier, is, so much ink has been spilt on trying to argue what this play means. I think where I tend to land is, how do I view this play back through Plato? Because how did Plato receive the Dionysian cult? And I would argue that the way that Plato pivots off the Dionysian cult is very similar to the cult that we see in this play. And so, like, when he has Alcibiades in the Symposium come out with the laurels and the flute girls, and he's drunk, like, he's very much pitching a Dionysus figure. Everyone agrees with that. But does he mean the Dionysian figure from Homer that's like just jovial and timid? Or does he mean this kind of cruel, unfeeling kind of bestial release that we see in the Bacchae. I think it's very much more towards the latter. So this kind of sets us up, I think. It sets us up too for another one of Plato's dialogues, the Euthyphro, because it has questions about piety. So I think we read this not necessarily to exhaust what Euripides' intent was, even though I think that's important, but rather because I think this view of the gods out of this kind of culture, this churning, if you will, on these questions, Plato's going to take up some really important answers, or at least better questions to them. All right, let's dig into the text. So
it opens. What an opening! Right?
I love this opening. I am Dionysus, the son of Zeus. So I mean, just like a few preliminaries right off the bat. Yeah. One, our main hero, our protagonist in this play is a god. That's unique. So we're going to have a god as a protagonist. Maybe just a little bit of backstory on him that he gives in the play is Dionysus is unique insofar as he had a mortal mother. And so he has a mortal mother. Her name is what?
Simile.
How are we? Simile?
Oh, yeah,
Simile. Yeah. And so Zeus gets her pregnant. And Zeus, cares for her as much as Zeus cares for mortals. However, she's tricked by Hera to ask Zeus to reveal himself in his glory. Like Zeus is like, oh, I'll give you whatever you want. What do you want? Hera tricks her into asking to be able to see Zeus in his glory. He says, you don't know what you've asked. And so, this is almost, God forgive me, this is almost like touching the ark. Like you can't survive this. And so she's basically burnt to a crisp while pregnant. However, in his Zeus capacity, he's able to save the unborn baby, and he sews the baby up in his own thigh. And the baby gestates in his thigh and then is born. And this is where Dionysus comes from. And what's unique is, well, there's several things that are unique, but the other thing that's unique is that he has a mortal mother, but he is fully God. And we could, I guess, attribute that to being sewed into Zeus's thigh, maybe. Mm-hmm. But regardless, we don't see this, right? This wasn't the case with Achilles. This wasn't the case with Hercules. These demigods, right, were always half God, if that occurred to them. But he's fully God. And so that kind of lends a little bit into the premise of the play, which is there's an identity crisis going on. So Dionysus has returned to Thebes because people are doubting who he is, right? He says this explicitly. He says down on, for I have come, this is 25, I am reading, which translation am I reading?
Aerosmith.
This is the Aerosmith one.
Not the Steve Perry.
Yes, this is the Aerosmith one. He says on line 25, for I have come to refute that slander spoken by my mother's sisters, saying that Dionysus was no son of Zeus. So he's coming in here, and I think this is going to be important to the play, that a lot of this comes into his identity and who he is. And he says that he's coming in, right, to show him, right, to prove to them that he is a god. But the way he goes about doing this, I don't know, I have questions.
And just to underscore one point here that I'm sure many of the listeners have worked out, but for those who haven't, Dionysus is very young. He, unlike the Olympian gods that we're accustomed to, that are much, much, much older. I mean, as those who followed the Hesiod Theogony podcast, we know that all the gods have an origin within Greek mythology. So there's a time and place where they were born or they came to be. And that is true of both Zeus and Dionysus. But Dionysus, at least within this particular mythological story, isn't one of the old gods. He's a very, very new god. In fact, he is younger than some of the other characters that we'll meet, the human mortal characters that we'll meet in this particular play. And so as we begin to think about Dionysus, I mean, he's very resentful because, there are people who are dissing his mother and accusing her of being a liar. And the question is, well, what reason would anyone have to believe in such a god who would be younger than those he's trying to convince?
Right.
So,
And I mean, there's a parallel here to actually. I want to point this out because we're going to see it a few times that surprisingly in this play, which is filled with, I think, some unsettling violence and perversions, we actually see some really interesting comparisons to Jesus Christ, which I really shocked me the first time I find him. It's really like finding a diamond in the rough. You're like, wait, what is this doing here?
yes.
And one of them, this is a slight one, but one of them is just the general principle that, prophets are not accepted in their hometowns. And actually, from when we're recording this, that was the gospel reading not too far away from now, a couple Sundays ago, in which Christ can't really perform any miracles. He's in his hometown. They know who he was. They knew he grew up as a boy. They knew who his parents were. This can't be a son of God. And so you actually see a similar dynamic here of Dionysus. It's like, we all know your mother. We know who you are. You're not a god. And that makes sense, right? Another preliminary, I think you actually might have been the one that mentioned this, maybe in Sunday Great Books, that this one doesn't start off with like a herald.
Right.
It doesn't start off with a third party coming in. We always get, like, you think about the Oresteia, you always get like kind of a third party that's speaking at the beginning that kind of sets up the context or whatever. This is just a really bold, I am Dionysus.
I have come. I am here.
Yeah.
Like in the flesh, quote unquote, but I am present. And that in itself, I think, is quite shocking to an audience to be face to face with a God who is claiming that there are those who don't believe. And so, of course, the audience should believe because there he is on the stage, at least within the context of the drama. And so it creates a very unique and novel just presentation, setting, beginning.
And speaking of him, I mean, as kind of a novel presentation, he himself, right, the character of Dionysus on the stage, he's presented as effeminate. He has these he's a male, but he has these long blonde curls. He's beardless. And then again, the actors are all wearing masks during this time period. And so one thing to remember is that he has this like big smiling mask that he's wearing. And I think that's part of the unsettling nature, this kind of demonic underpinning that we see in this, is that he does these like horrific things to people while having this giant smile on his face. I mean, for a mundane example, you see this same juxtaposition in like the Joker and like the Batman series, right? That's what makes him so, there's something about him that's deeply unsettling because he stays comedic even when doing horrible things, which makes him deeply inhuman, right? That it's not soliciting, this should solicit some type of like empathy, but it doesn't. And so Dionysus is able to come in and do terrible things to people, seemingly having no empathetic impact on him at all.
Yeah, there's a fairly well-known, at least within analytic philosophical circles, well-known book written by a philosopher named Noel Carroll on the philosophy of horror, and in it he attempts to define monsters, and what he arrives at is a definition that emphasizes a kind of what you're talking about, an interstitiality, that they're interstitial, that they sort of, they don't belong to fully one category or another category, but they are uncanny in a way. And so, I mean, if you've ever heard of like the expression the uncanny valley, where, animators or people who work in robotics try to create these very human-like representations, and there's something odd and very scary and unsettling about them. It's usually in the eyes, the way they haven't been able to really represent eyes, human eyes. But I mean, I think in the same way, you get this because he's a god, but he's a god incognito. We're told that he has disguised himself. And so it's unsettling to see the god, but then that he has somehow disguised himself. And why is he disguising himself if his whole point is to try to convince people that he really exists? Why would he arrive in a kind of disguise? It's very strange.
He also, I guess we're just stacking preliminaries upon preliminaries, but another one too to watch here is somewhat similar to Aeschylus in his Agamemnon play. There is a lot of play between the genders here.
Gender bending,
So remember, Clytemnestra was like a man, and Agamemnon would be effeminate, or like a woman. And you see some very similar things. One of the things I wanted to point out, what does he look like? Because that actually plays into then his parallels with Pentheus. Yeah, so just kind of moving on into the narrative as he's kind of giving this opening monologue. A few things to note. One, like we mentioned, just notice how often Euripides tells us that this came from the East, that this is something foreign. This is something imported into Athens, into greater Greece. Because I find that to be maybe not dispositive, but a key clue into Euripides' point that something has happened to the cult of the Bacchae, right? This is not the timid little wine god anymore. Like, this is something that's actually pretty unique. And he just hammers this home over and over again. The original Bacchae that come with him are from Asia, which this is all kind of modern day Turkey, right? Like Asia, what we would call Asia Minor, like where Troy was, right? Where Troy over there was. But there's been this importing of something alien into the Greek mind, into the Greek religion. And I think trying to figure out what that is helps unpack what Euripides is trying to do here.
Yeah, and shortly after that, and Deacon, I'm interested to hear your thoughts about his emphasis on, what is so important to the Dionysian cult. It isn't necessarily a set of beliefs, but rather mysteries and rites. In the translation, Dionysus says, I taught my dances to the feet of living men, establishing my mysteries and rites that I might be revealed to mortals for what I am, a god. And so there's something real vital to the Dionysian cult that involves action in practice. It isn't right away. We can see it isn't about cognition, or what you said earlier, logos. Dionysus isn't. He doesn't necessarily want us to wrap our minds around him, but he wants us to be participating in these bacchanalic, very frenzied, sort of drunken, wine-driven, ecstatic practices.
Yeah, it's a mania, right? It's not a logos. It's not a intellectual reflection. It is a mania, right? There's this like bestial release of violence and sex that accompanies his cults, his rites. I mean, to piggyback off of that, is that he's also not worshipped in a temple,
Yes.
right? He's one of his cults are out in nature, and particularly have a theme of ascent, right? They go up the mountain, right? They go up the mountain to find the god, and that's something that Plato's going to parallel pretty heavily in his Symposium. Is this really the true path of the ascent? Like, if we become, because how this cult works, and we'll see it in the text, like there's a few spots where it's a little bit more clear, is they go up, and one of the things they'll do is they'll consume animals, right? They'll consume these sacrifices, and in doing so, part of that is that they believe that they become one with the god. One of the questions I think that we're going to have in this is, what is piety? And so, like, if you remember when we studied the Oresteia or even the Theban plays, piety plays a major role. How are we pious towards the gods? What gratitude do we have towards them? And how does that gratitude animate a certain action towards them? This, I think, in a lot of ways just throws it on its head, because the question is Dionysus good? And, a flat read of it is like, well, he's a member of the pantheon, right? So therefore you have to be pious towards him. But we just see, there just seems to be that Euripides isn't that flat, that there's something else at work here. And so, we have a whole lot of questions that start to pop up, which I think is something that you've paid attention to more than I have, is how does each character then react to Dionysus?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how is if we want to contextualize the reaction as a piety, like what kind of piety do they have? And is Euripides using these various characters as different analogs to how humans relate to the divine? And is there a good or the bad? But he turns it all in its head because we still can't figure out whether or not the god is good or not. And so, for instance, like if we have, Pentheus's character, if he pushes back, then is he being impious, or is he being virtuous if he doesn't follow this false god, but it's a real god? But is the real god good? And if he's good, by what standard do we call him good? And so this is where, for those who are familiar, I think this play sets us up really well for Plato's Euthyphro, his dialogue on piety, which then also gets into a question of the nature of the divine.
And to come back to just briefly one point that you made, which I thought was really, really good, and that is that the Maenads, as they're sometimes called, or the Bacchae, the followers, the priestesses of Bacchus, do not worship in a place. I mean, well, they worship in a place. They're out there in nature, but there isn't a dedicated place where they practice their rites. And I think that those who are listening to our conversation and who come from a traditional sort of Christian background, sacred places are really, really important. I mean, they're vital to worship. And so this was, as you noted rightly, Deacon, this was even true for the Greeks. They had their temples, they had their sacred places. So this is yet another aspect of the cult that is strange, that is sort of antithetical to what everyone would have come to expect from a religion, and which would yet be yet another reason why someone you would expect why that person would be skeptical of Dionysus's claims to divinity.
Yeah, there are a lot of unique aspects to his cult. So one of the things too that we're tracking is like, what's his purpose? So he's coming to reveal himself. Yes. Dionysus is very much tethered to his own self-identity, and I think that theme starts to unfurl a bit throughout the whole play. But he affects the women first, and I guess on its face that's because he specifically states that he is coming to refute the slander spoken by my mother's sisters. And so there is a feminine aspect here at the beginning. And so it's interesting that he comes with Bacchae, right? He comes with a certain cult following from Asia, these Asian women. But then he also causes the women of Thebes to enter a mania and to become part of his Bacchae as well. And this happens right at the beginning, right? I mean, this is the situation. So to a certain degree, we're in media res, to a certain degree, right? Like things have already occurred. And so he's already driven them. And it's interesting that I think he does this like as a punishment, right? Because of that offense, this is line 33 or so. Because of that offense, I have stung them with frenzy, hounded them from home up to the mountains where they wander, crazed of mind and compelled to wear my orgies livery. And so, every woman in Thebes, but the women only, I drove from home mad. And so it's interesting to me that this disordered, well, I guess I'm playing too many of my cards, but that this Dionysian cult at the beginning affects the women. And I think in the play, like I said, you could probably tether that to the fact that it's the women that have been slandering him. But then he turns them into his Bacchae. And this kind of gets into, yes, he's coming to reveal himself, but how? Well, this isn't just like an evangelization. He could do that easily. He could stand in the middle of town and be like, I'm a god. Watch me turn this chicken into a donkey, or whatever he wants to do, right?
Miracles later. I mean,
right.
The earthquake, we'll get to that, the palace collapsing. So he has the capacity.
He could do these things, but he doesn't. He wants to prove his divinity through a punishment, through punishing them for their offense. But I think, as you've already noted, is their offense really that irrational? Like, hey, we know that like this woman that was not a god, that's not a goddess, was pregnant, and now we're saying her child is fully God. I mean, even if you were a complete adherent to the Greek pantheon, there's some things about this that are incredibly suspect.
Yeah, I would just add maybe one or 2 points, and that would be that he accuses. So he's I have come to refute that slander spoken by my mother's sisters. So Semele, and then as we'll learn, Cadmus is the dad, and he had, I can't remember the number, like 5 or 6 or however many daughters. So the sisters are the ones who didn't believe that Dionysus was the son of Semele. But rather than just striking them mad, he strikes every woman in Thebes mad. And
Right.
so there's a disproportionality here, I think, that at least occurs that should occur to the audience. So we can understand why, well, maybe he has good reason to be angry at Semele's sisters, but yet he drives every woman in Thebes mad. And I think, again, that just raises the question of, does the punishment really fit the crime?
No, I think that's a really good point. Is his punishment disproportionate? I think a proportionality question is one that probably haunts the entire dialogue, because this begins, actually occurs to me that this dialogue, we're talking about Plato, this play begins with punishment and ends with punishment. It's bookended by that. And probably, I would argue, it's bookended by disproportionality as well, right? Are the punishments actually fitting to the so-called crimes? And so we're going to see this on both sides of this play. A few other things that occur to me too is the comparison between Dionysus and Athena, both of whom come from the body of Zeus. And so Athena comes from his head, and she very much is an analog for his mind, the divine mind, right? Zeus dialoguing with Athena is almost an internal dialogue between him and his own intelligence, right? I mean, that's why there's very little daylight between them. We see a little bit in the Iliad at times, but for the most part, there's not a whole lot of daylight ever between Zeus and Athena. So now we have a god who's come from his thigh.
Well, you could even extrapolate and say from his loins.
Right. Yeah, which would get the point across even more, because that's what I think. Then Dionysus, I think, then in a lot of ways represents this kind of baser appetite, right? These passions, the erotics, actually, right? This kind of satiation of the lower passions. He's tied to wine and sex, but here in the Bacchae, he's also tied to violence. And so these things all kind of intermingle in somewhat unsettling ways he just becomes very bestial. There's a bestial release of passion here that at times is incredibly inhuman and cruel. But there is very much a comparison, I think, between the god that comes from Zeus's head and the god that comes from Zeus's loins.
I agree.
And so too, I want to point out that I am struck. Now, some people listening might know that I actually, I've done some writings, and part of my own spirituality plays heavily into eros, right? Into this erotic love, which might sound odd if you're not familiar with how that term eros is used in the Platonic tradition, and then the Neoplatonic, and then in the Christian tradition, particularly with the Greek fathers, as this natural love that we have that desires to be satiated. It's a need love. It seeks to be satiated in beauty. And, Plato and our Greek fathers in the church will talk about that this is a love that actually naturally calls us to ascend. It naturally calls us to ascend towards God. And so you see some deep parallels here of the erotics in this play, that the erotics of Dionysus are also a call to ascend, to go to the mountain and have communion with the divine. But the other thing that I find very interesting is that eros is always also tied to our self-identity, because our eros is a self-love. It's a need love. And what we satiate our love in helps us understand who we are, right? We find our identity in that which we love. And, you see this beautifully with husband and wife. So when a husband loves a wife and becomes married, his self-love is extended to her because she becomes part of his flesh, right? So there's an erotic binding between husband and wife that happens. And then he finds himself in his wife, right? He actually comes to know himself in her as part of their identity, that they're actually one flesh and, head and body and how they live. And so it's really fascinating to me that Euripides, obviously before the Symposium, but he's playing off these erotic desires, can see even here that eros is so intimately tied to self-identity that Dionysus comes in, and his whole scheme, his whole kind of erotic mania that he paints on Thebes is all tied to him showing them who he is and them coming to know him. It's very much tied to identity. And just to anchor this in the text, I don't know, line 46, 7 or so, he says, "Therefore I shall prove to him and every man in Thebes that I am a god." So the women are punished and turned into a mania. And via that punishment, the men will come to know that he's a god. It's an interesting, it's an interesting play there, right? So we step into our first chorus.
And the
align.
choruses are very important, right, Deacon? I mean, all of the
Mhm.
choruses. I mean, choruses in all of the Greek tragedies that we've read together are important, but I think in this play in particular, the chorus really does provide a lot of vital information and access to Euripides' mind.
So what would you say in this first chorus is like the theme, the main principle? Like, does it have a pedagogical purpose? Like, what would you say this chorus is?
Well, this one in particular, I didn't have very many lines underlined, but the one that struck out to me, and I know that you brought this up in our formation meetings as well as during our great books session. But blessed are those. What does that remind us of, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Have you ever
another. There's another kind of Christological analog here, another allusion, if you will, to the Beatitudes. And when I read this, I found it really
Yeah.
shocking. And one of the things that I was trying to discern, which I have not, and so if you're listening and you know the answer to this, please comment, is, sometimes when Christ does things in the New Testament, if you're not familiar with reading other ancient literature, you think Christ like invented something, right? Like he invented the parables, or he invented, certain things. When in reality, he's taking certain tropes that would have been known to his audience, and he is repositioning them or using them to teach some truth. Like, for instance, one thing that occurs to me is Peter denying him 3 times. And then Christ, our Lord, has Peter say, "Do you love me?" 3 times. And, for those who know, underneath that, there's like a juridical custom or ritual of the saying something 3 times binds you to it. And so you see that ritual playing out in Christ. So one of the things I was really curious about that never would have occurred to me is, are the Beatitudes something like that? Are the Beatitudes actually formulaic? That there would have been other Beatitudes in the ancient world? Because you see this in the play, like you said, it's clear as day. Blessed are those who know the mysteries of the God. Blessed is he who hallows his life in worship of the God. So there's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7
Mhm.
of these Beatitudes, and we
Right.
see Christ give a list of Beatitudes too. So one of the things I was really curious about is, was this blessed art those who X? I was wondering if that was a religious ritual at the time that our Lord then uses to give, like, well, here are the true or perfected Beatitudes. But here in the Dionysian cult, we see Beatitudes tied to his mysteries as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, there must be some sort of historical precedent or analog to the attitudes that we're familiar with on the Sermon on the Mount. The other thing, just to, I guess, keep in mind as we're reading ahead, is that the word that's being translated by Smith as blessed or blessed, is really pious. It's the same word that Plato is going to use
Oh,
in the
really?
Euthyphro. Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So something to track as we read through this particular tragedy, and as we move on to the Euthyphro, is that piety really seems to be weighing on the minds of the Greeks at this particular time. What constitutes or what amounts to true piety or reverence? How should the gods be revered? And of course, that comes out a bit clearer later when we are introduced to these different characters who seem to have different approaches or different attitudes towards piety.
Well, you kind of see the immediate crisis that can happen, right? We go back to Hector and this kind of threefold piety that we've seen. And it's also been haunting Aeschylus. It's been haunting Sophocles' writing, where you have this piety towards, your family, and then the polis, and then the gods. And the gods are the ones that order. The divine is the highest order, and the highest always orders the lower. Well, this is really the lesson in Antigone, is that we live within an ordered whole, and this is what Creon can't do. So your reaction up into that higher echelon is the highest piety you have, the piety towards the gods. Well, if we can't figure out what piety is, I guess phrase it this way: the question of piety is a question of justice. How do we give the gods their due? And if I can't figure out what's due to the gods, how then do I order the lower? How am I supposed to order the family? How am I supposed to order the polis? And you actually, I think, somewhat lampooned Antigone for this in that play, because that was one of the questions that I think you raised that I thought was a really good question, which is, how does Antigone know? that this is what the gods want. Like how, like as Creon, at least at the beginning, if you remember in the play, he's not against the gods. Later on, he kind of makes some statements that are slightly blasphemous, I think. But in the beginning, he's like, no, why would the gods, want to, bury a traitor that was against the state and all these other things? So it's really, even in Antigone, it's a question of piety. How do we order an action in the family and the polis according to the highest principle, which is the divine? But if we have conflicts amongst piety, then it's going to disorder the lower levels as well. So the Bacchae then throws this whole thing on its head by putting in a divinity that we're not even sure is good.
And again, you've read my mind, and I think that you might have peeked at my little legal pad here, because that's something that I had actually written down, namely the similarities between the Bacchae and Antigone. And what I wrote to myself was, the dangers of piety unfettered to nomos. Unfettered, right? And because this is something that really comes up in the Antigone, I think very, very clearly, is how, there's this struggle between faithfulness or fidelity to this higher law, which Antigone has, and then a faithfulness to the state, which Creon has. And so we're sympathetic towards Antigone. I think that we have this sort of natural or instinctive tendency to sort of see Antigone as the heroine. She's doing the right thing, because it's not just her reverence for the gods, but it's reverence for her brother, her family.
Right.
But yet there's this tension between piety to the gods and doing what's best for the state. Right. And I think that very same tension is evident, as we'll see shortly in Euripides, because these Asian Bacchae, or these Asian Maenads, are very transparent in their disassociation from Greece. These are barbarians, and they say very explicitly later that we do not follow the laws of this land.
But see, that's like part of why I tend to read this as a warning, because then all of a sudden your piety towards the gods is disjointed and actually even disordering to the polis and to your family. And it just seems like that tends to throw what we saw with Hector and Antigone and these characters on its head. Right. So this then brings in the question is like, what is Euripides critiquing here?
Yeah, I mean, we'll come across this line later, but it really made it, as I was rereading this for the podcast, it made a huge impression on me when the chorus is singing, and these are the Asian Maenads, for those following. And at one point, this is much later, around line, we'll get to this, but just to sort of put this on the table, around line 1005, they say other things are great and clear and make life beautiful. They're talking about wisdom, right? They say, I don't resent wisdom and I rejoice it. But other things are great and clear and make life beautiful. And here they mention purity, piety, day into night, honoring the gods. And then they say rejecting customs outside justice. Rejecting customs outside justice. Which again is this tension between, well, what is justice tied to the nomos, or is justice something that exists apart from the laws? Which again is this question that Aeschylus, Sophocles, I mean, they're wrestling with, what is the true nature of justice? Is it something that is convention, or is it something that is nature? And clearly, we're being a nature cult. We all know where the Bacchae are going to locate it.
Right. Yeah, no, I think it's a fantastic insight. Yeah, maybe just to kind of like keep pushing us forward. Yeah, that chorus, I'm not sure if I distilled an overall theme, just the same kind of observations that we saw, right? It emphasizes that the Bacchae are coming from the east. We saw the Beatitudes. We saw that they worship outside and not in a temple. The movement, of this cult is very much outdoors in nature. It talks about the thigh in the womb a little bit before 100, so you kind of get into that intellect versus the passion.
And then
again.
Possession by Dionysus.
Yeah,
right?
Dionysus, and I'm not sure. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but
Yeah.
like, I don't remember possession, like a god possesses you. Again, like we would see that analogous to like the demonic,
Yeah.
but like I don't remember this really in the Greek mythology. I mean, the closest I can come up with is the mania that the muses kind of give you. Like
Right.
they use you as an instrument, um, and maybe that is really maybe that is the same. But this idea that the cult is that you commune with the god, you become one with him, and he possesses you, and you open yourself up to possession. Like you don't really see that with like
No.
Ares or Athena, like this kind of intimacy. There's again, it's just something very unique about the Dionysian cult.
No, I mean, even in that great scene that I bring up repeatedly in Iliad, where Achilles is about ready to murder Agamemnon, Athena doesn't possess Achilles. You know, depending
Right.
on how you read it, she grabs onto his hair. Right? So she, like, physically, you might say, if you take that literally, holds him back. So she
Mhm.
doesn't enter his body and possess him and stop him that way. And so yeah, this I think is very unique, and at least from a contemporary point of view, it's quite terrifying.
It is. And I
Because
think the question here too, one of the questions here that as I kind of wrote at the end of that chorus is Euripides is presenting this as the ascent to the divine, right? So this is the path to the divine. You go up the mountain. We'll see some other rituals that come up a little later, but like right now, like you go up to the mountain, the god possesses you, you eat the sacrifice, you participate in the mysterious rituals. And I think that's part of the question of Euripides, and definitely a question later in Plato is this really a true path to the divine? Is this really a true path for man to actually ascend to God? And if not, if this is a false path, then what is this that's actually being presented? So we get Tiresias.
isn't that
Tiresias comes
interesting?
back. And
Yes.
I tell you what, I find Tiresias' character here, I think in certain ways he is emblematic of the entire play because trying to figure out where Tiresias falls, I don't think you can determine how to take Tiresias without understanding the whole moral of the play, which is a complicated thing to figure out. Because I guess what I mean by that is Tiresias always plays like the Gandalf figure. He plays the prophet Nathan figure, right? He walks in, he tells everyone what they've done wrong. What he says is a one-for-one correlation on what the gods want, and then he leaves. And you better do what Tiresias said. I mean, think about him at the end of Antigone, right? He
Right.
comes in and says, "Here's what you need to do, and you're at fault, and X, Y, and Z." And so, anytime Tiresias comes in, like that's what he plays. And so, but now we have a play in which we're questioning the nature of the god. And if you question the nature of the god, that's going to cause you to question the nature of the prophet because those two are tethered. And so Tiresias comes in, he's blind like he always is, and he's with Cadmus, which is kind of like the founder of the city, right? He's the
He's the dad.
grandfather.
He's the dad of Semele and
And so the
and
grandfather of Pentheus, right?
Pentheus.
He's Tiresias. The way I read this is Tiresias is pro Dionysus, right? And he's trying to convince him, that we need to partake in this new cult. And like down at like 195, Cadmus is like, "Are we the only men who will dance for Bacchus?" And Tiresias is like, "They're all blind. Only we can see," which again is a trope every time Tiresias comes in because he's blind. And therefore, the poets are always playing off who can truly see. But look at Tiresias at line 200. He says, "We do not trifle with divinity. No, we are the heirs of customs and traditions, hallowed by age and handed down to us by our fathers." Okay, that sounds good. "No quibbling logic can topple them, whatever subtleties this clever age invents." So, one, it really kind of plays into this concern we have that the Dionysian cult is anti-logos, right? It's not simply that it's not logical, it's something that's actually contrary to logic. It's not compatible with logic. The mania and madness of Dionysus is not harmonious with logos. And two, I mean, is there not irony to this insofar as like we have to believe the customs handed down by our father? Dionysius is younger than half the people in the play. Is this not another guidepost for why a lot of the people don't believe in him? He's not a tradition handed down by their forefathers. I mean, right? I mean, am I reading it right? No, we are the heirs of customs and traditions hallowed by age and handed down to us by our fathers. This cult is not handed down.
Yeah.
This cult is new. And actually, it's not even handed down by fathers. It's not even originating in Greece. Dionysus goes to, Asia Minor and comes from the East and brings this whole new cult with him. So it's interesting because Tiresias is, I'm not sure if Euripides is painting him as this character of irony because he's saying, let's engage in this cult. Here's why. But the reasons he gives seems to actually only create more warnings.
Well, the way that you presented Tiresias initially, I mean, the one word that I just very commonly associate with Tiresias is sobriety. He brings a certain sort of sobriety to the table. And the Tiresias that we encounter here has very much, to use a common expression, he's drunk the Kool-Aid. Like he's at least it seems as though he has bought in, hook, line, and sinker. And shortly we'll listen or we'll read Tiresias's rather lengthy exposition of the Dionysian theology or whatever you want to call it. But no, I mean it doesn't square. I mean, everything that Tiresias says about the cult and about Dionysus doesn't really square with everything that we have learned up to this point. Everything that Dionysus himself has told us.
Yeah, I agree. There's something off in his character. But this is like, again, it's like using the prophet Nathan or Gandalf. It's using some character that's usually just so clear. And you can have such confidence when they speak that they are speaking on behalf of this divine, of this force, to then put that character in ambiguity, even a little bit of ambiguity, is unsettling because it's not who we've seen them.
Right.
That's not his role within the Greek mythology. Also, one thing that occurred to me is, what occurred to me too is that Tiresias has his own gender swap.
Mm-hmm.
And that's never occurred to me when I read this, but it just occurred to me right now. And I know you and I discussed that. I think when we did the Odyssey, that's it. Yeah, when we did the Odyssey, I think you and I discussed that when Odysseus has to go down into hell, into Hades, and talk with Tiresias. That if you ask, like, who's Tiresias? One of the backgrounds to him is that there's all kinds of origin stories about how he became blind. And so one of the stories is that he saw two snakes coupling. And when he saw that, then he was transformed into a woman. And then he lived as a woman for an indeterminate amount of years. And then he saw the same act again, two snakes coupling, and he was changed back into a man. And so then Zeus and Hera get into an argument about who derives more pleasure from sex, men or women. And so they decide, well, who could you ask better than Tiresias? Which is a hilarious premise if you really think it out for multiple reasons. But anyway, they go ask Tiresias about what's the answer. And he says, I don't remember the exact line, but he says something like, oh, well, I mean, of course, women derive 10 times more pleasure in sex than men do. And Hera finds this to be an absurd answer, and she strikes him blind. And there's like this trope in Greek mythology that, like, Zeus, a lot of times mortals get punished because Hera's angry, and Zeus won't undo the punishment, but he like gives them some type of gift in return. And so what Tiresias got in return is unerring prophecy. And so it's interesting here then in the Bacchae that, one, I'm not sure he's unerring. Well, one, I guess this isn't prophecy, but it is commentary on the gods, right? He's a seer. He should know what he's talking about. And I don't know, maybe he's playing an early Euthyphro figure, and now that I think about it, but that he also, though, has his own gender mixing between male and female in a play that really plays off of that, right? We have this very effeminate god. The Bacchae go out and actually start playing a very masculine role. Poor Pentheus steps in to drag. And so it's interesting then that Tiresias, it's not really mentioned in this play, but Tiresias has his own backstory that kind of plays into that question of gender.
I hadn't thought about that. That's actually a very interesting observation. Again, I hadn't
It
actually
just
put
it
that
just
together
occurred to
yet.
me as I was thinking about it. Not something I contemplate deeply or often, but
So that would well explain, well, among other reasons, why Tiresias would be present in this play.
it could.
And
It
the
really
audience
could.
would have known this. They would have
Mhm.
put two and two together.
Well, we get the entrance of Pentheus, right? King of Thebes. So he's down at 215. He comes in and he sees these two old men, Tiresias and Cadmus, dressed up, looking ridiculous for the rites of Dionysus, right? And he's the grandson of Cadmus, who's basically the founder of Thebes, of these people. In Pentheus, you can see very quickly why, Enlightenment thinkers found him to be so much of a hero, right? He can come off as like anti-religion, like, what are you old men doing? You're embarrassing yourself. But even he, I mean, just kind of tracking themes, right? He also actually very critically talks about that these women, these Bacchae, are importing here to Thebes filthy mysteries. And he even says the festival is rotten.
Yeah, I love that.
And this has
You've brought this, that this is interesting given where this would have been performed.
right, the play is being performed in a festival dedicated to Dionysus in Athens. That's where this play is being shown. So you really have this character stepping up and saying, these mysteries are filthy. And this festival is rotten, while they're all sitting in a festival dedicated to Dionysus that historically would be downstream of his advent.
Yeah, the Pentheus, the Euripides' decision to introduce Pentheus in this way, I just find very interesting because, it's initially, he comes across as very sympathetic in that he represents, I mean, sure, we could describe him as being a skeptic, but he seems only skeptical of the Dionysian cult. I guess the inference that we would draw, or at least the implication, is that he's still willing to buy into the traditional pantheon, right? Because I mean, look at it this way. I mean, Dionysus, if he were to exist, would be related how to Pentheus? Cousins. They'd be cousins because Agave or Agave, or however you want to pronounce it, her name. I like Agave. I know that other people don't, but I mean, Agave was Semele's sister. So
it's Pentheus's mother.
yeah,
right?
Agave is
Okay.
Pentheus's mother, and so Agave and Semele were sisters. Dionysus is the son of Semele. Pentheus is the son of Agave, so they're cousins. I mean, so if you're Pentheus, you're thinking to yourself, "Oh, come on! This, I don't have a god, for a cousin. That's absurd."
Right.
And so, I mean, again, I just think the way of introducing Pentheus here is, I mean, I think Pentheus's response is the way that any of us would respond to the claim that we have a god a god as a family member.
But that's part of the tension, right? Is that his rational, I mean, let's just call it a rational approach, seems then to be contrary to piety.
Right. Exactly.
And that seems to be the tension with Pentheus, and how you interpret Pentheus, at least in this moment, because I'm not entirely sure Pentheus holds true, but how you interpret Pentheus in this moment, in this kind of early part of the play, I think then has to be tethered to how you read Dionysus overall. Because if he's like a great and good god, he's just like Apollo comes down, everyone's fine, then no, Pentheus is impious and he's wrong. But if Dionysus is something perverted, right, he is something that creates these filthy mysteries that are imported from the East, then is he not worth pushing back against? Like, is this not a rational thing? But again, the piety and the logos don't go together here.
No, and just one other just brief thought is that as I think about Pentheus and how old he must be, I mean, and I was trying to work this out in my head. I mean, he had to, like, we're talking maybe in his 20s, late 20s, early 30s, right? So he's still relatively young, I guess. But yet he presents a very mature position, and one that's very much rooted in convention. And I mean, he's a kind of a religious conservative of sorts, and I mean that is very much in contrast to Antigone. Granted, Antigone would have been much younger in her play than Pentheus is in this particular play, but yeah, I mean, again, we're talking about how these texts sort of have conversations with each other, and we set Pentheus beside Antigone, and we see two young characters, but two young characters who seem to approach religion and piety in very different ways, which I just find really interesting.
No, I agree. I like that comparison. If we go back into the imaginative exercise that this play is being performed in Athens, directed by Euripides the Younger, I think it's fascinating to then take that in this context of Pentheus versus Tiresias, because Pentheus, as we mentioned, ends with like these filthy mysteries and this rotten festival. But then look at Tiresias, how he responds. And this is like, I don't know, 272.
Oh
I
yeah.
tell you, this God whom you ridicule shall someday have enormous power and prestige throughout Hellas. Now, this line to me, personally, is brimming with meaning, because if Euripides' point is to warn people about the cult of Dionysus, that something has been imported from the East, that something alien to Hellas has come in, well, we're not actually learning about a new cult in real time. This is a cult that has already saturated itself in the entire Hellenized world.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's prophesying something that has occurred, because they're sitting here in the festival. Dionysus has already saturated the Hellenistic world. And so this is like ringing all the alarm bells. If you read this as, wait, no, this is wrong, like this is like waking up and finding, your entire culture has been invaded and you just realized it overnight.
So does this lend then to the one interpretation or the one reading that would regard Euripides as being critical of these novel religions or cults or faiths?
Yeah, I think maybe just play some more cards here as we kind of unravel the text. Is that to put this in a historical context, there are commentaries that look at this and say, well, what he's pointing out is, again, remember, Homer's Dionysus is very different than Dionysus in the Bacchae. And is this just like Euripides' invention? Like he just decided to make this god, cruel and a bestial release? No, he's actually really commenting on something that has historically happened. And this Athenian empire that grew basically started trading with the East. And one of the things the East has then imported back into Athens are its fertility cults.
Right.
And where the fertility cults then take a foothold inside of the Hellenized world is they get tethered and connected to the Bacchae, to Dionysus.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening then is that the thesis is, if you take this route, is that then there's a notable transformation in the Dionysian cult from like this kind of timid wine god of Homer to this kind of anti-logos, bestial release, sex and violence, erotics that we now find in the more classical period. A few things too with Tiresias. He gives this like weird, this is like line 290 or so.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not entirely sure I understand his intention, but he gives this like weird interference for Dionysus's, that's a hard word to say, origin story, where it's like, oh no, he wasn't sewed into the thigh of Zeus. This is a grammatical mistake, and it's really that Zeus showed something, not sewed, but showed something to Hera. It's like it was a dummy god. That way Hera wouldn't try and kill him. And I found it weird because I didn't quite understand why he's running interference on this.
Well, and
what does it matter?
Yeah,
what does it matter if he was born in the thigh?
Yeah, my only response to that, and again, this is something that I haven't really delved too deeply into, but the kind of wordplay, the punning, or however you want to describe it, is very reminiscent of what the sophists would have done at that time. Right? They were very, keen on language and word, etymologies and word origins and how words relate to each other. And, this is all played up very, very clearly in Plato's Cratylus. So, this may be a wink and a nod to the sophists that, hey, perhaps Tiresias is engaging in a bit of sophistry here, because really this whole speech, and you may agree or disagree, Deacon, but I just see this as Tiresias's attempt to try to formulate in words a kind of theology or a creed, or call it what you will, of the Dionysian cult. We've already been told that what really characterizes the cult are the mysteries and the rites, which are practices. And, those aren't necessarily expressible in words. But what Tiresias is here trying to do, and by the way, it gets the approval of the chorus. But what the chorus says is interesting. But anyhow, what he's doing here, I think, is the best that one can do, one's best effort at trying to manifest in words what is fundamentally, again, you described it, erotic, as being rooted deeply within the passion. So I don't know what you would say to that.
Yeah, well, I definitely think Tiresias is running interference for the god. Like, what his, I like the idea that maybe he's trying to subscribe a creed to him that I don't think really sticks. I think that's the way I read him, is like he's trying to do something here to legitimize the cult, but it doesn't seem to be working, because some of his statements.
But it's authentic.
From
right?
his standpoint, you think he's being authentic?
Right, because as we'll see, this is what really distinguishes Tiresias from Cadmus. Cadmus, as we'll see, is inauthentic.
Okay, that's a good parallel. Before we get to that, yeah, there's like this line which I think is hilarious, which is, Dionysus does not, I admit, compel a woman to be chaste. Right.
Yeah,
so there's a whole question then that kind of haunts the text, is like, are they really actually having orgies out on the mountain? And so, because I think the answer is yes. And so because Dionysus mentions earlier that how he dresses the Bacchae, and he actually mentions the orgies, and then later Cadmus and Tiresias come down. But there's a question about, like, is this really happening? So Tiresias' thing here of like, no, he's not, because also it's all their wives, right? It's all their wives, it's their mothers, it's all the women in their life that are out there doing this. And it's like, wait, have they all of a sudden now started engaging in orgies? And so this line is just hilarious, right? Well, he doesn't like compel a woman to be chaste, right? Some things might happen, like he doesn't like compel them to chastity, right? But he says, even in the rites of Dionysus, a chaste woman will not be corrupted. And I don't think that is true. No. Now I like your distinction. He might think it's true, but I don't think it's true overall. But again, this turns Tiresias' character inside out, because we're supposed to be able to trust Tiresias on what he tells us about the divine is absolutely true. And in this one, I don't think you can.
No. And so at this point, I just want to put to you a question then. So we've now been introduced to two characters, Pentheus and Tiresias, both who have different, might say, perspectives on the cult. Pentheus is very skeptical, as we've already noted, and after he speaks, the chorus leader declares, and this is a little bit earlier, around 263, what blasphemy! What blasphemy! You have no respect. Have you no respect for the gods? But how does the chorus leader respond to Tiresias? Well, he says, or she says, Apollo would approve your words. Now, I first of all, so it's got the imprimatur of the chorus. Good job. But Apollo would approve your words? Why Apollo? Why not Dionysus?
Yeah, I guess the only thing that occurs to me on its face is just simply that he's the god of prophecy.
That's what I was thinking.
Right. And so Tiresias is mainly a servant of Apollo, coming in and telling the truth and being a seer and these kind of things. And so I took that as you have spoken truthfully, right?
Right. But again, so I think that's correct. But so just to kind of double back a second. So one approach to the cult, Pentheus, is bad, blasphemy. Tiresias is better. So at least Apollo would approve the words, and the leader goes on to say, wisely you honor Bromius, which is just another name for Dionysus, a great god. I mean, the course leader doesn't go much beyond that, but at the very least, if we were to sort of rank order piety, if you will,
Right.
Tiresias certainly, his approach is above that of Pentheus.
Do you want to walk us, because our next little section here, do you want to walk us
It's
into
very,
Cadmus?
yeah, it's very short. And when I first, I have to be honest here, when I read the Bacchae the first time, I got to the end, as we'll see, Cadmus gets punished. And I kept asking myself, and I wrote in the margins, why is he getting punished, right? Like he believes, right? He participated in the rites, or at least, he was on team Dionysus, right? But then, after rereading it 2 or 3 times, there's this passage here where he gives his reasoning or his justification for believing, and so he's addressing his grandson here. My boy Tiresias advises well, but he doesn't tell Pentheus that we ought to believe in Dionysus because of everything that Tiresias has just told us. Instead, he says a bit later, around line, 333 or so, even if this Dionysus is no god, as you assert, persuade yourself that he is. The falsehood is a noble one. Oh, what does that remind us of, Deacon?
Yeah, I mean it's a foreshadowing, right? It's an antecedent to Plato's noble lie,
Right.
right? That there are I'm glad you phrased it like that, because that was exactly my read as well. The first time I read the Bacchae, and then we got towards the end, and all of a sudden Cadmus just gets, not only does he get punished, I mean, he receives a severe punishment.
Right.
Same reaction. I was like, this is disproportionate. What did he do wrong? And this, yeah, this has so many implications. So one, again, if you think Euripides is critiquing religion as a whole, Cadmus has this is a very modern take, right? I mean, a lot of people believe this on a modern level, which is, well, what does it matter if God's real or not? What does it matter if Christ is real? Like, following him has certain benefits. It's a noble lie for the populace. Right. And Cadmus here, there's a few layers here, even for Cadmus. One, it's a noble lie that benefits him and his family, because then there's a mother of a god in his family. And so he's trying to show Pentheus, hey, this brings value to our family. Why would you push against this? And again, this goes to like your point, which I think is very good, of trying to track how all these different characters relate to the divine as different analogs of what piety is. And so here for Cadmus, he's not very pious as I would read him, right? He's very practical. He's almost like Machiavellian, which is just like, listen, this would be a benefit. Who cares? Dress up, go have sex on the mountain. Like, why are you pushing against this? Our family benefits. I also think it's really fascinating if you push into Cadmus himself, because Cadmus is famous for sowing the dragon teeth, right? So like the people of Thebes have their own mythic origin story, right? He sows the dragon's teeth, and from this comes the people of Thebes, just in short. And so the guy who told everybody that is also now commenting that sometimes these religious stories are just noble lies that we tell people. And I think Euripides is playing off of that, of like, well, wait, does that mean the entire origin myth of Thebes is also a noble lie? Which would really play into Plato, because part of the reason Plato gives the noble lie is to give the citizenry, right, this understanding of who they are and their own identity, because they can't all be philosophers. So we got to come up with some kind of lie to just understand how to structure society. And so I think there are some really antecedents here, not only to Plato, but also just like how a lot of moderns view religion.
So you've already mentioned how Bacchae seem, in a way, the play seems to inspire or feed into Symposium, how it feeds into potentially Euthyphro, and now we've seen yet another Platonic dialogue, the Republic. that again is connected in a very important way to this play, which again it emphasizes just how pivotal, how vital this particular play is to understanding many of the other texts that we're going to be reading. I would just bring up one or two other thoughts. And during the, during our great books meeting, this is a kind of Pascalian wager. It's not Pascal's wager, but it is a kind of a wager that Cadmus is presenting, where, as you put it very well, Deacon, there's real practical value. It's pragmatic for us to believe this. You don't have to, don't really believe it, but believe it for the sake of the benefits. The other thing I would just mention is I find it, and again, this is, I think, it shows the brilliance of Euripides. So this is basically the third position that we have here. This is the way, at least, that I tend to read this, right or wrong. So we start out with Pentheus, his position, which is totally thumbs down from the chorus leader. Then we get Tiresias, who gets, Apollo would approve your words. But does the chorus respond to Cadmus? No. And I think that's what allows the reader, by the end of the play, to wonder, why did Cadmus receive this punishment? This was so unjust. But then, had the chorus interjected here, and had they told Cadmus, you're doing it for the wrong reason, that would kind of spoil the ending in a way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I like that.
So it's a real, it's I think a wise, dramatic move by Euripides to not give it away in a sense, to not give away the ending, or to reveal Cadmus as having ignoble or impious inclinations.
Yeah, no, very good. The kind of pushing into like the next chorus.
Oh, this is awesome. I love this chorus.
Well, good. Let me maybe just let you know where I spent most of my time. What caught my attention mainly was around 395. When it starts talking about like what passes for wisdom is not, unwise are those who aspire to outrange the limits of man. And so, because here it's the chorus, it's the Bacchae, then trying to give a commentary on what is wisdom.
Right.
And of course, like if this is the problem of piety, see, all these things interlock. So if piety is ultimately towards the gods, but also you can be pious towards your polis and the family, but it's ultimately then a question of justice. Like how do we order these things? I have to know what to give to the gods, because then giving to the gods, giving to the divine, informs what I do with the polis and my family. Well, wisdom then is often read as knowledge of the whole. Right. So justice then is ordering everything, but wisdom then is that I know not just some things, but I know how those things interrelate, right? I know the cosmos. I know the ordered whole. And so then when the Bacchae start commenting on wisdom, it's like, well, wait, we have grammatical work to do. What does wisdom mean then for the Bacchae? And so, just like some random notes I put down, not random, but my notes tethered to this, can piety be rational?
Right.
Is that a question here, right? Can piety be rational, and to what degree? As a Catholic, the contemporary question is, what's the relationship between faith and reason?
Right.
That's what we always talk about, right? Piety for us piety somehow became very thin for us. It's, piety is, I say certain prayers and I pray the rosary and etc. But piety in the ancient sense is very thick, right? It's like, no, there's this gratitude there. And you see that in the modern sense, but I don't think we don't see really piety as like a species of justice, or like, really an essential part of ordering the cosmos.
But the Greeks did.
But the Greeks did, right? And so I think that's here in Euripides, because like, can piety be rational? Is Pentheus supposed to be some analog for logos, and the Bacchae are an anti-logos? And so we have two claims to wisdom. But it's weird for the anti-logos cult to have claims to wisdom, but then wisdom just becomes a fiat, right? It just becomes a blind piety of just like, well, how you be good? You just obey the gods. It's a certain type of divine voluntarism. So if I guess we're backending ourselves into the Euthyphro problem here. But if God just says, if Dionysus says this thing is good, don't think about it, just do it. And that's a type of theology, right? That's a voluntarism in which God, whatever is good, is what God wills.
Look, that's what I had mentioned in passing to you, that I thought that the Bacchae, whether it directly or indirectly inspired Plato's Euthyphro, I do think there's a Euthyphro dilemma. Yeah, I know it's improper, that's sort of anachronistic because this would have been written before the Euthyphro, but I do think there's a Euthyphro dilemma present, that it's incipient, it's a proto Euthyphro dilemma.
Can you give us a working definition of Euthyphro's dilemma?
Yeah, I mean, so just I'll be very, very brief about this, and then you can maybe fill in the gaps. But so the main question in the Euthyphro is, what is piety or reverence, right? Reverence to the gods. And so Euthyphro and Socrates begin to have this conversation because the dramatic setting is that Euthyphro is on his way to court to prosecute his dad for murder. And he considers this to be an act of piety, and Socrates says, "Oh, what luck, because I have myself been accused of impious actions, and so you prosecuting your dad for this act of impiety, you would know better than anyone, so teach me." And this all then leads to one of a series of definitions where Euthyphro says, well, piety is what is loved by the gods. And then this allows Socrates to say, well, wait a second, this could mean one of two things. Are you saying, A, that the pious is loved by the gods because it's pious? Or B, are you saying that pious things are pious because they're loved by the gods? And so it's a causal relationship. So
right.
Does the pious bring about a kind of loving relationship within the gods, or do the gods cause things by some sort of, you might say, divine command, right? And so, I mean, yeah, this feeds directly into what you just brought up, which is, okay, Dionysus. Like, are the Bacchae, these women, or are people to be considered pious or blessed, because they truly believe? I mean, isn't this kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's exactly that. I mean, if what is good simply because the divine wills it, then you have to follow Dionysus. There's no judging Dionysus, because you talked about dilemma. There's that means there's two of them. So sometimes it's talk about the two horns. So as you mentioned, but to phrase it differently, one of these is that what is good because the gods will it. And so here, what would be good is just simply following Dionysus. Right. Just follow him. You actually see this exact phrase later when the servant comes to Pentheus, and he's like, "Hey, all these terrible things are happening. I don't know what you need to do, but you need to follow this god because he's powerful, right? Like just follow him, right? Well, how do we know these things are good? Well, they're good because the gods tell us so,
right?
Or are the gods not? Is what is good isn't created by the will of the gods, but rather the gods are adhering to something that is objectively good. It's something that they actually adhere to. In that way, you could judge the gods according to a standard. So then you could have a god who acts poorly. You could have a god that does not act well. And the thing is that this whole thing gets thrown into a mix because, well, we already kind of have this because we have a pantheon in which the gods are not monolithic and they all fight against each other anyway. And so even in Homer, we're actually judging the gods by some kind of standard because the gods don't agree. So therefore, they have to be judged by something. You can't say, and this is part of the Euthyphro, it's very difficult to say that the good is what the gods will when the gods' willing is not monolithic. And so, but in this text, I think the problem we're getting into is like, okay, are things good because Dionysus says they're good?
Right.
Or is there some good that Dionysus is supposed to be adhering to, but he is not? And and who makes that determination?
Right. And I mean, this was sort of one of my strong reactions to this play, when I first read it, which is, okay, is Dionysus even a god worthy of worship? Because I would say, as a contemporary 21st century, well, whether I'm a Christian or not, I think the obvious answer is no. He's not worthy of worship. Right? So, I mean, Euripides, I think, is really challenging his audience with this question about, well, what do the gods, in other words, like, do the gods have to be a certain way in order for us to justifiably revere them? And that means,
Right.
who brings this up? Plato brings this very question up in the Republic,
Right.
does he not? I mean, this is his criticism of the Homeric gods, is that these aren't the real gods.
Well, one way to look at this is, so we've talked about this like trifold piety, right? So we have piety towards your family, towards the polis, and towards the gods. One way to look at this is that what Euripides in the Bacchae is intellectually pushing his audience to think about is there something else above the gods? Is there something that even the gods adhere to? And so, like, one way when people read the Euthyphro is that when Euthyphro talks about the fact that, like, oh, there's a good, and it makes a distinction between the good and the gods, that is this not an antecedent understanding of Plato's forms or Plato's ideas? That there's something above the pantheon that then can judge the pantheon itself. And then the question is, well, wait, where does a monotheistic God fit into that? And that question is going to have to be taken up on the podcast on the Euthyphro. But here in this dialogue, I really do think there's a lot of antecedent questions that we see explicitly in Plato's Euthyphro that are implicitly being asked of us as we are kind of trying to judge Dionysus. Because the big problem is, okay, let's say, no, I think he's bad. I think he's a bad god. Great. By what standard are you actually judging him? And I think that starts to push us into understanding Plato's forms or his ideas, right? That there's some metaphysical reality that good cannot simply be a consensus of what we think it is, but rather when we think of the good and we're all kind of thinking about it together or judging things, there's something truly good, right? The good by which we can judge all other things and whether or not they are good. And I think we see that in a shadowy way in the Bacchae.
I agree, and just one brief comment to that is, well, I mean, then this I think it really does point to a broader debate within Greek society at that time over whether truth is something objective or whether it's something that is just simply rooted in taste. I mean, this comes across. I mean, comes out very clearly in the dialogues where you have, on the one hand, Socrates, who seems to be this kind of realist about truth, who believes in the substance of piety, the forms, the ideas, things that are independent of the mind. And then on the other side, you have Protagoras and the other sophists who, man is the measure of all things, that what is right because you think it so. And I mean, that I think is precisely what you're getting at, Deacon, and that is, I mean, how do we arrive at a coherent, objective answer to the question about which gods are real, which gods are worthy of worship? Is piety just simply believing, or is piety something that has to be in a way be earned?
Yeah, I think that question of, is piety rational? Does piety integrate us into an ordered whole, or is it something that can just be alien and isolated? And as you already mentioned, the Bacchae make it really clear, I think, that this piety can just simply be isolated, and it can even destroy the things underneath it, the polis and the family. Let's look at one of the most fascinating parts of this, which is where Dionysus is brought in as a captive.
Oh, yeah, I know you love this.
In front of Pentheus. So this starts at like 435.
What does that remind us of?
Right. So here's our, I lost count of what we are, 2, 3, 4 at this point. Here's another really fascinating comparison between Dionysus talking to Pentheus. He has a god in front of him that he does not understand, and he's asking the god about himself.
Right.
And Dionysus is answering in a certain way that's very truthful, but
Right?
Pentheus doesn't understand the irony of it. And it's kind of just crashing downhill. And as you alluded to, this
Yeah.
scene has a lot of really interesting parallels to our Lord before Pilate, where Pilate also is then questioning the man in front of him, not understanding that the man is God. And probably, one of the most ironic statements in the New Testament is where Pilate is looking the Logos incarnate, right, truth itself, in the face and asks him, well, what is truth? And so there's like this deep irony between this. And so it's really fascinating to me how these two scenes parallel one another. And again, part of me though is unsettled because Dionysus is such a disordered and perverted character, but there's no denying. And I guess one point too, to push into this, and we talked about this when we read Homer, there's a whole series of scholarship that really tries to argue that these things in the New Testament, in a certain way, are very deliberate because the Hellenized world, even the Hellenized Jews at the time, when they were hearing these stories, would have been thinking of these things. So, for instance,
of course.
and so, like, for instance, Nestor feeds the 4,500 or 4,800 on the beach. Christ feeding, his 5,000. So he feeds more than him. I mean, obviously, Christ has a descent into hell, which is like the most characteristic Greek hero. I mean, to be a true Greek hero, you have to descend into hell and come back out victorious, right? The greatest of heroes do this, right? So there's what's the other one that's always interesting? Oh, the other one we talked about when we did our Year of Homer and Odyssey is that Odysseus is the king returning home, and he is known by his scars. That's how they know him. Right now, obviously, Penelope, doesn't take that, and it's really interesting that she has her own intimate way of knowing it.
Wow.
All analogs fail at some point. That's why they're analogies and not the same thing. But if you remember, Euryclea, the nurse, comes to know him, and even I think, if I remember correctly, even the swineherd and the cowherd, the other, I was like some other herder, not the goat herd. He did poorly, but they come to know him by the scars too, which is very analogous to our Lord and Saint Thomas. And so there is a good scholarship here that I think is asking how much of these stories would have been in the back of the mind of the Hellenized person that then when they're hearing about Jesus Christ, he's like stepping into this heroic role, if you will, and then perfecting it. And I think it's a fascinating question.
Yeah. No, I like that a lot because I think that skeptics would certainly point to a lot of these antecedent stories, and they would argue, oh, well, the apostles are just infecting the story of Jesus and using the old stories, importing, right? I mean, this is what many skeptics would say, that, oh, well, the story of Jesus is just a pastiche. It's just a collage of these other heroes and stitched together. But I like the way that you put it, where Christ is stepping into, in the flesh, like he is bringing it, body and soul, stepping into this role of the hero, where that really, I think at the time would have been an eye-opening experience to people, because they would have been like, where have I've read this before, and here it is. Whereas I was first, I first encountered it on a page. Now I'm encountering it in the flesh.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting because it's a watershed deal, and I think that a lot of people, it makes them uncomfortable because they like to think of the Gospels and the New Testament as like something very like isolated that happened in a vacuum, and somehow if there's like parallels to it in other texts, that somehow takes away from its authenticity. Whereas as we talk about on the podcast, I read it contrary to that, insofar as no, I actually think a lot of these antecedents were providence tilling the soil for the coming of Jesus Christ and coming to understand, right? St. Paul says he came in the fullness of time. And so, we talk about Greek reason coupled together with Hebrew faith under Roman order prepared the world for Jesus Christ. But that Greek reason there really is a broader Hellenized culture and the Hellenized Jews, that there was something unique about that Greek culture that helped prepare the world to understand Logos incarnate. And so you can, obviously the Logos is the zenith of that, right? That the Word became flesh. But at the same time, there are then all of these kind of secondary and tertiary stories, etc., that I think also have echoes in the New Testament. And I think that helps pave the way for evangelization.
I like that. I like that image too of tilling the field, of preparing the field for the seed or the seeds that would be received in the passion and death of Christ. That's a really good image, and I think I like that a lot.
Yeah, it's something that I've thought a lot about, and the genesis of my thought on that is Pope Benedict XVI's Regensburg Address. So if you want someone who's much more intelligent and has a lot more authority than I have to articulate this, I would go read the Regensburg Address, in which he talks about the de-Hellenization of the West, and that it's the concept of the logos that really brought this up. And then modernity is actually a rejection of the logos. We think modernity is a rejection of faith, but it's actually a rejection of logos. It's a rejection of logic. He says the radius of man's reason has shrunk.
I love that. That's beautiful.
So I guess going back then to this very fascinating kind of face-to-face between Pentheus and Dionysus, just a few things as we're tracking themes. One, again, this Asian influence is very key throughout this. Again, these things are imported from the East. We also there's a lot of irony in this, the face-to-face. Again, he talks about foreigners. Pentheus talks about that foreigners are more ignorant than the Greeks. But again, this is a dialogue of irony. And so, the Greeks, we're so much smarter. But then it's a cult from the barbarians that seems to be saturating and taking over the Hellenized world, right? So again, what is Euripides kind of positioning to show us here?
Well, I mean, in fact, that connects with your remark just a second ago about de-Hellenization, right?
I like that. The Hellenized world is being de-Hellenized by importing these Eastern cults.
Yeah,
I like that. Yeah, Dionysus, he talks about, the darkness is well suited to the devotion, right, of his cult.
It's creepy, right? The whole cult is very creepy and unsettling about how they practice the rites, who practices the rites. Just earlier you mentioned the uncanniness of it, and so it's in the dark.
There's a parallel too here that we have to note is there's a lot of things in this text when they're together like this for the first time that then have parallels later when Pentheus and Dionysus are together again, and Dionysus is dressing him as a woman. Right. There's a lot of parallels here, because, for instance, like here, Pentheus is threatening basically to undress, right, to tear apart Dionysus, right? He talks about his curls belong to the god. And so you get these things of dress and curls and threats, and then later on, Pentheus is put into curls. He has like a wig on. He's undressed of his armor and puts on the dress of a woman. So there's a lot of parallels. Like, we're getting the first half of this comparison right here, and then it kind of completes in that second narrative.
And in the back of our minds, we have to just remind ourselves that this Dionysus' plot is unfolding. Like, this is something that he is planning out step by step, and so each of these threats that Pentheus is making, Dionysus is going to invert and impose upon Pentheus himself.
There's also, I think, again, we could return to the concept of identity.
Oh, right. Yes.
Because, like 505, you do not know the limits of your strength. You do not know what you do. You do not know who you are. Pentheus responds, I am Pentheus. And Dionysus responds, Pentheus, you shall repent that name. And so there's, again, we get into this theme that Dionysus seems to bring a loss of identity, right? The mania, which decouples you from the logos, your own logic, also seems to then bring in a mania that makes you lose your identity. And obviously, I guess, probably the most, pressing of this is not only what happens to Pentheus, but then what happens to his mother. And so we get these two contrasting narratives of a loss of identity. The Dionysian cult robs you of that, and then that mania, that erotic mania, gives you a new one. And I really want to stress that your eros, your erotic love, will always give you an identity, but in Dionysus, it seems to rob you of your true identity and give you an artificial, a false one that's predicated on some type of, bestial release, some type of mania or cruelty.
Could you, Deacon, just maybe briefly comment on how this stands in contrast to the Christian faith and like the beatific vision? And so, I mean, there, we often talk about becoming one with God,
Right.
but that doesn't mean a loss of one's own identity.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, so the particularly like on the eastern side, right? Eros is a good. Your erotic love is actually a good. And so, in short, your erotic appetite wants to satiate in beauty and be happy. That's what you want. And so, your soul is kind of tripart. It seeks different things. But erotic's got tied to sex because, particularly on a baser level, that's like the most fulfilling thing, and it also tends to be the most easily understood. So the young man wants to satiate in a beautiful woman. He's drawn by her beauty. And this is why Diotima in the Symposium actually talks about that erotics in a young man are typically awoken, if you will, by a beautiful woman. She becomes an analog, though. And so what's different is in the Christian tradition is that the woman doesn't become then something to simply consume. So I consume this woman and she's done, and then I got to go find another woman and consume her, but rather the woman becomes an icon of greater beauties. She's an invitation to ascend, and the soul then moves from lesser beauties to greater beauties, like the beauty of the soul. A man who actually truly loves a woman starts to love her interior life. He starts to love her soul. It starts to make him think about his own soul, talk about virtue, arete, excellence. What's it mean to be a good human? This gets into like the thumos, right? Oh, well, right. Then what do I seek? Glory, and etc. And the highest is wisdom. Okay, well, I have an erotic appetite as a rational animal to satiate in this wisdom. And then above that, we have the divine itself. Even Plato thinks in the Symposium that the philosopher can satiate in the divine beauty itself, beauty there being the form of beauty, the idea of beauty, which is one of the transcendentals. And so eros then, the erotic love in that sense, particularly when you finally satiate in the divine, because what we would say, St. Augustine helped us understand that all of Plato's ideas do have a metaphysical address. Aristotle was wrong. The forms actually do exist. They exist in the divine mind. They exist in the Logos. They exist in Jesus Christ. And so when we ascend the ladder of love and satiate our eros in God, that is when we truly start to understand ourselves, because it's for God that our eros was made. And that's where our self-identity is truly found, because two things. One, your erotic appetite is infinite. Like you always want to be happy, right? I don't ever want to be unhappy. So the problem is whether you're satiating on a woman or anything else, even if you have the most wonderful spouse in the world, she's finite. And so if you want to talk about where I think our whole culture is suffering, the disproportionality between having an infinite erotic appetite, but trying to satiate it on finite beauties is at the heart of a ton of frustration in our culture. And you're either dooming yourself to an endless consumption pattern where I just constantly try and consume beauties to be happy, but I end up being unhappy because it's a life that's exhausting. Or logically speaking, I have to find a beauty that is itself infinite, that then my infinite appetite can satiate on an infinite beauty and finally find rest. And so this is why the Neoplatonic scholars in the Renaissance, the Catholic scholars, would talk about that love is a good circle, because God implants in you this eros, this appetite, this erotic love, and it calls you back to him, because he's the only thing that can actually give you peace and satiate it, because he's beauty itself. He's the infinite beauty itself. And so your erotic appetite that's infinite was actually designed for an infinite beauty, which is God. And in God then, our eros is satiated. We find that self-love, that need love. We find ourselves in God and how he truly knows us. And yeah, unlike some of the Eastern religions, when we come to know God, I know myself more of who I truly am. I actually would become more of Deacon Garlick by knowing God and not less. I don't phase off into the nothingness or the abyss. I actually am satiated and find myself. And then it's in loving God that my need love, my self-love is actually satiated, that then gives me a peace to then have a selfless love or charity or agape in the Greek. So that our erotic love is actually the basis of having that grace to receive a supernatural charity. Eros is natural, charity is supernatural. But we also look at the saints sometimes and say, how would they love the beggars all their lives? Like they give and give and give and give. Like how do they do that? Well, it's not that they don't need to be loved. I think that's the problem. We turn them into these things that don't need love. No, their eros, their erotic appetite is satiated so much in God that it overflows, and they can have a selfless love that doesn't need anything back. Not because they don't need to be loved, but because they are already loved in God, and so they can give to others. So there's this beautiful coupling, this kind of, I almost call it a perichoresis, like this relationship between the two of erotics and agape, between erotic love and charity, that then kind of spiral us up towards God, a selfless love and a self-love, if that makes sense. So
Yeah,
that was way too much than
no. I thought that was excellent, and I know that the listeners. I mean, that there's a lot there to unpack, but I mean, I'm not a theologian. I'm just a lowly philosopher. But like, what really strikes me, based on what you just said, is that the sort of the Dionysian understanding of eros, or the Dionysian approach to eros, really does render love impossible. It's paradoxical because love is a relationship, right? If the Dionysian approach destroys the self, then one could never say, I love you, or I love Dionysus, because the I is gone.
Yeah,
so,
it's a destructive. I think one way to phrase it here
not
is
even love anymore, because love has to be between a subject and an object, or a person and another person. And so, I mean, I think someone who's reading this play closely can only infer from, based on what we've read so far, that Dionysian love is irrational, and that it's paradoxical in a very deep way.
No, I think that's a brilliant insight, because it destroys the self, and in destroying the self, then the self really isn't giving a true love. It's a disordered. I think that
where's it coming from? Where's the love even coming from?
I guess like the play my cards here is that I think that, I'm not sure Euripides would phrase it like this, but I think reviewing this back through a Platonic lens,
yes,
I think Dionysus in his cult represents a disordered erotics. So I just gave probably too long of a summary on how
that was great.
How eros is an ascent on the ladder of love. So notice then that Dionysus has his own ascent. They go up the mountain. And so both of these ascents can't be true. And this is where I think this is the crux of the Symposium, is that these two ascents can't be the same. You can't have this erotic love that moves the soul through its parts from lesser beauties to greater beauties according to logos, according to logic, right? It actually harmonizes the entire soul. And then Plato, doesn't have it terminating in a monotheistic God. To my knowledge, Plato never really articulates the relationship between the God and the forms.
Gone close.
He just, we really, St. Augustine gets a lot of credit there, I think, for finding that metaphysical address. And so these two things can't be the same. And so I really think that's what the Symposium does. The Symposium inherits a Dionysian erotics that is now culturally normative, which is why most of the Symposium is dominated by the concept of pederasty. And Plato is trying to take an idea that already exists, erotics, and actually show, no, there's a different type of ascent to the divine. This is actually a false ascent, and this is the true ascent. And that true ascent is why the Symposium set the tone of Christian spirituality until maybe the 1400s.
And this is why Deacon Garlick is on Team Plato and not Team Aristotle.
I think Aristotle's I think Aristotle's a pretty good Platonist, but he
minus the eros, as you noted.
Yeah, he's a little unerotic. Okay, so we have another chorus after this. This is at 520, and this like little passage here at 525,
where
it says like, enter my male womb, I name you Bacchus, and to Thebes proclaim you by that name. I mean, just the male womb. I mean, just you see the problem now that we've kind of played more of the cards here. You have this, in my opinion, you have this disordered erotics that Dionysus brings, and he himself then is an analog of this, right? He has a certain gender confusion about him himself, and so he's masculine, but he's masculine, but he's also effeminate. He tends to be very petty, but then he's capable of great violence. He's born of a man and a woman, in a certain way, right? He gestates in his mother and then gestates in a man. I mean, the whole thing is just conflated, and it has this disordered erotics to it and what he stands for.
And it's not just biologically confusing, it's metaphysically confusing. I mean, I think, and that's what causes, at least I think within the audience, within me at least, a kind of, as you know, a disorientation. And I find all of the language that Euripides utilizes here to be really unsettling to my reason. Like I can't make sense out of who Dionysus is. I can't make even sense out of what's motivating the Bacchae.
Well, and then he serves as the fountainhead, right? So he himself has this type of gender confusion in him. Right. And so then he causes that gender confusion in others. Right, because the Bacchae take on very masculine effects. And actually, at the end of the play, agave, I'm from Oklahoma, you want to say agave like tequila. But she actually prides herself on, before she kind of comes to herself, she actually prides herself on like masculine traits and being like a man, whereas she just tore apart her son who was dressed like a woman. And so he flips all these like Bacchus, Dionysus is the fountainhead of this type of gender confusion, which again is deeply tied to our conversation on the fact that erotics bring you a self-identity by that which you love. And so if those erotics are disordered, your self-identity and how you see yourself is going to become disordered. They're a one for one.
And just the question that, briefly before we move forward, that keeps popping into my head is, how is any of this good for Thebes? How is this? Yeah. It is unsustainable. Thebes cannot survive. No polis, no community can survive if the Dionysian cult wins.
Yeah, I think that's really a key. I think that's a really key insight. Is that does the Dionysian disordered erotics, is that contrary to both familial and political stability?
Yes. Well, it's already eroded familial stability. We've seen that already. He's driven all of Cadmus's daughters mad.
And all the women.
All the women. Yeah, the women.
These are mothers. I mean, it's going to become more explicit later about, Euripides really doubles down on this, but their mothers, their wives, all of them now have left, and they're doing God knows what on the mountain with who knows who. Right. Okay, so then we have thunder, lightning, the earth trembles, and Dionysus and his chorus start going back and forth. Dionysus says, "Let the earthquake come." That's 585. What did you make of this scene where the earthquake comes and it's destroying, if I understand correctly, right, it destroys both the jail that Dionysus was supposed to be entrapped in, but we find out that didn't really actually happen, and the palace, right? The overall palace comes crumbling down. And we find out, as there's basically this destruction, we find out that Dionysus wasn't even actually like shackled. No. Like Pentheus took him down, and he thought that he had Dionysus all chained up, but actually it was a bull, right? So Pentheus looks like a fool, sitting there like tying up this bull, thinking he has the best of Dionysus, or he doesn't know that's who it is right now. And Dionysus is just sitting there staring, watching him happen. It reminded me of it makes a fool of him, and it reminds me of what happens to Ajax, right? When Athena, remember Athena, like she makes him go mad, and he thinks he's beating up Odysseus in the tent, but it's actually like the ram. Right. And then when he finds out what he's done, he feels like a fool, and he goes and kills himself.
Right. Yeah, I guess so. I'm glad you asked this question, because this, I think, forces us to return to a question that we raised initially when we first started this conversation, and that is, what is motivating Dionysus, right? Okay, so we've got a couple of options on the table. Right? It's on the one hand, he says, look, I want people to believe in me. I want people to accept me as a god, right? But then he's motivated by a kind of revenge, a kind of malicious, this anger that he has towards the women, Semele's sisters, who don't believe in him. And so the question then is, well, what's really more important to Dionysus? Is it the belief, the piety? He wants to instill piety, or he wants to earn a sort of reverence from the Thebans, or is he just trying to get revenge on the daughters and Pentheus? Because what he's done here with the earthquake and the palace collapsing is he's performed a miracle.
Right.
Which is an invitation for Pentheus to go, oh, I was wrong, I'm sorry. And so I think, and I don't have an answer to this question, this is more of just throwing it out there, but like in performing this miracle, does Dionysus hope that Pentheus has a change in mind? Because if Pentheus goes, you know what, you are the god, that kind of ruins Dionysus' desire to seek revenge for his mother's slander. Is this making sense?
It is. I like it because I'm not really sure I have an answer either, but I think one of the things that bothers me in this section is why Pentheus doesn't see that Dionysus is a god, right? I mean, he sees. So to your point, right? One answer might be that Dionysus isn't going to allow him to do that because he's using Pentheus as the catalyst to punish Thebes,
right?
And show him he's going to be the prime example of what it means to deny my divinity. And so Dionysus actually has no interest in there being a metanoia, right? This turning around. And I like that theory because, you watch all this happen. You watch this guy destroy the palace, the jail. You watch him be scot-free.
Right.
And again, he's just sitting here with his golden curls and his big smiling mask, right? It's very unsettling. It is demonic. And Pentheus just doesn't seem to click. And that was something, I don't know. I like your theory because I don't have a good working understanding of why Pentheus can't see this. Or even if he does have like suspicions, be like, I need to back off, right? But he doesn't. Or at least I don't perceive him to.
Well, and for the tragedy to work, because the play can't end with Pentheus converting to the Dionysian cult and then everybody living happily ever after, right?
Right.
There has to be a tragic flaw, much like in Oedipus, where Oedipus doesn't see the fact that he married, or that he married and slept with his mother. So, Pentheus, there's a kind of stubbornness here, a tragic stubbornness, that allows the tragedy to continue. And in a way, too, I think this allows the reader to not have so much sympathy for Pentheus. You can't sympathize too much with Pentheus. You can't. In other words, you can't. This is one of Aristotle's points about tragedy, where the tragic figure can't be a totally good and noble person, because that's not going to generate the kind of response that tragedies ought to have. You don't want to see the hero die to the villain. That's not a tragedy. That brings about not a sense of pity, but a sense of sadness and despair. And so I think that for this to work, there has to be a tragic flaw. And the tragic flaw that Euripides gives Pentheus is this kind of stubbornness. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, it's certainly a working understanding. I'm not sure I have a better. Yeah. I'm not sure I have a better one because they don't really actually see. They don't seem to actually Euripides. Maybe the way Euripides handles that is that Euripides doesn't seem to allow Pentheus to have enough time to process.
No,
because this happens and then the messenger runs in,
right,
and brings in like this whole new stuff. But even then, the messenger terminates in saying, hey, all these terrible things are happening, you should probably follow the god. And Pentheus literally just witnessed another terrible thing. And so you still kind of think, like, what is causing him? But again, I don't like just blaming it on the tragedy. But again, this is like the same thing with Creon and Antigone. Like, Creon, why can you not see this? But all Antigones have these like imploded characters. But again, this one's all turned on its head, because I'm not entirely sure Pentheus isn't the most laudable character in this whole deal.
No, and just one other thought that came to mind briefly, and that is, we'll see very shortly the collapse of Pentheus's resolve, where he eventually,
Right.
and I think like living or experiencing this earthquake, the palace collapses. I mean, Pentheus at this point is in shock. He may not cognitively be able to work out what's happening and recognize what he's just witnessed and experienced as a miracle, but this has caused him great, however you want to describe it, emotional despair. Like his character has been shook to the core, which is going to allow Dionysus later to perform the gender switcheroo on Pentheus, which will then of course lead, as we'll see, to,
I like the word switcheroo.
death.
Yeah. All right. Well, that brings us pretty much to the middle of the play. And so I've greatly enjoyed our conversation. I think we went pretty deep, but hopefully also allowed first-time readers to kind of track, I think, the major subjects. And so we'll do part 1 this week. Keep reading or reread the Bacchae, and we'll do part 2 next week. And so, Dr. Grabowski, I greatly appreciated a lot of your insights and commentary today.
My pleasure. I love this.
So everyone, you can follow us on thegreatbookspodcast.com. You can check us out on Twitter and Facebook, if I remember to update it. And what else do we have? Patreon. We greatly appreciate everyone supporting us on Patreon. You can get on there. If you support us, then you get access to a lot of our guides. And so I think that'll be very good. And so next week, we will do part 2 of the Bacchae, and then we'll be looking to move into Aristophanes, reading his clouds, and then also reading frogs. And then we will be looking to do a roundtable on the Greek plays as a whole, pulling out themes. And then we will get into Plato, and it is going to be amazing. I'll release our schedule sometime soon of all the guests we're going to have on when we discuss Plato. Thank you for joining us today on Ascend, the Great Books Podcast, and we will see you guys next week.